I think that podcast musicals are a really cool idea that I think will continue to grow, and I think that there are lots of opportunities to continue to make the art form better. But I think there's a lot of things you can do with it if you do it right. What's up, citizens? It's time to sit down, put in those earbuds so as not to disturb the neighbors, and join us for another episode of Off Book, a podcast where we talk all about Broadway, movies, TV shows, and anything else we want to geek out about. I'm Marc Stoufer III.
And I'm Ashley Szurna. Today we're going to be talking about podcast musicals and how a Broadway-style show can be translated into an audio-only format.
I didn't even know that podcast musicals were a thing until just under a year ago, and I wasn't immediately sold on it. But I've really come to love them because they can do so many things that the traditional musical can't, and they can really be a unique experience. I think that there's kind of a stigma around it because when you think of musical, a lot of it is the visual element that you just can't get if you're listening with earbuds. For one thing, you're not actually in a theater, and it's not live like theater is traditionally. You also can't see anybody, so it's a lot harder to get the emotion when all you have is the voice, because it's one thing to create an authentic performance that seems genuine. It's another to do so when you only have your voice and the audio to lend that.
Yeah, one thing that I think is cool about them, because like with Broadway, you know, like they have the like soundtracks and stuff you can like pull up on like YouTube and listen to. And doing that before seeing the show itself is one thing that I've always loved doing, so that I can kind of imagine what it will look like. And that's one cool thing that I think that podcast Broadway shows can do. Like you can interpret the show in your own way instead of being shown what it is.
Right, and I think that's a pretty big reason that podcast musicals are starting to become a thing, because there's so much you can do to let the audience figure some stuff out. Something that is interesting to me is with the release of shows like Hamilton, where so much of it is told through the music. You can listen to the cast album of Hamilton and almost get the same experience. Obviously, it's going to be a richer and fuller experience in the theater because that's how it was intended to be seen, but you can get most of the plot through just the music. And I think that the success of Hamilton and the success of the cast album and the ability of the cast album to get people to go see the show has kind of been a proof of concept for podcast musicals, because producers can see, oh, people are actually interested in a show and listening to a plot through audio.
One thing that I think is the downside of podcast musicals is if you don't have a very creative imagination and you can't really depict things very well, it's kind of like an audiobook if you think about it. Like that's what they remind. And if you don't really have that imagination, you're not going to enjoy it because you aren't going to be put into the story. You're just going to kind of be like listening to it and you're like, I can't like figure this out. I want to see this. Like a visual learner versus like someone who likes to hear things. That's definitely one downside to having these type of musicals that wouldn't be put onto Broadway.
Yeah. I think that on the other hand, there is a lot that a podcast musical can do that a traditional stage show can't. I think it isn't just an equivalent. I think that it, in some ways, is almost better, because it almost feels like I am the camera of this film, and I get to be following them around. To me, it's almost better than being in the front row of a theater, because then you're static and you're watching them on a stage. Whereas a podcast musical, if you can imagine, you can be right there with them, following them around, and you can be in the location in which the action is taking place. That was a bad joke.
Yeah, and like that's one thing. Like I love going and seeing musicals. Like I love it. Like it's one of my favorite things to do. But also, you know, during a musical, you might have to go to the bathroom, and you know you can't just get up and go because you're gonna miss part of the show. But with these, like you said, it can travel with you.
And you can pause it.
Yes. And you don't have to be stuck in the same place.
That's true. And now, an ad. Podcast musicals can do a lot. But a lot of these so-called creators are too scared to try some of the classic parts of Broadway. But not anymore. Because this fall, we're dropping our own podcast musical. And it's filled with only things that no one else is doing. Such as A full company dance number. A silent scene. A stunt fight. And best of all, state-of-the-art projections and motorized trucks. So be sure to check out our new podcast musical, Visuals, this fall on Spotify.
That was a perfect idea.
I know, I'm a genius. Anyway, back to the main program. No, we all know all of the drawbacks and good things that podcast musicals have, but so do the producers. And if you really analyze the plot of a podcast musical, it's going to be different than the plot of a traditional musical. And I think that what we've discovered is that podcast musicals may work well on stage, but it doesn't necessarily always work the other way. If you take a musical like Hamilton, because apparently we have a status quo, we need to talk about that every single episode. So Hamilton, if you want to sponsor us, go ahead. We're already doing ads for you, basically. Just pay us for it, please. Thank you. Anyway, Hamilton, with all of its complex storytelling and visual subtext, wouldn't necessarily work well in just a musical sense because there's so much that gets added. So the cast album is a good starting point and maybe enough to convince people to go see the play and tell them the story of the play, but it's not necessarily going to give them the full experience. So if you look at a podcast musical, my favorite that I've heard of so far has been 36 Questions. 36 Questions follows two characters, Jace and Judith. And Judith, their entire relationship as they met and fell in love and eventually got married was lying about who she was and pretending to be a person named Natalie. And then when we pick up, they have just gotten divorced and separated, but Judith comes back to try to convince Jace to take her back. And it's like a 3-hour show, but it takes place over about 3 days. And it's this very small story where you don't even hear a lot of extras because you don't need it. And I think that the podcast musicals, so they can take that and say, let's tell a smaller story where the audience can connect on a deeper level, because we can't have these big sweeping full cast numbers. I think that those are going to be the ones that are more successful.
Yeah, I also agree. And like you said about like the connection between like the audience, like with the cast, you're obviously not going to get that like same connection like you would in theater, but it kind of, like I said, like earlier, I said like it reminds me of like audiobooks, and you connect more to the characters, you get more involved with the characters, and you feel more with the characters. And I feel like with like live theater, you kind of just watch it and just like experience it, but when you're listening to something like that, you get more of a connection. You can put yourself in the shoes of the character easier because it's more of that like audiobook format.
They also have the ability to take advantage of things like music in the background and sound effects, and the fact that it's going to be the exact same every single time. So every version of the show that you're watching, essentially, is going to be perfect because it's been recorded and then edited and then mastered, and then everything is exactly the level it should be, and is ideally exactly how the authors and the actors had tried to make it. So you don't have any of those side effects of live theater where you mess up, or something doesn't go the correct way, or a sound effect is too loud, or a prop comes in too late, because everything is precise. And I think that in creating a more precise environment, it almost feels like it's more live, because you can resonate with it so much more knowing that you're getting the perfect performance.
Yeah. And the big question that I have, do we think that podcast musicals are going to become a lot more popular than they are right now? Do you think that they won't, like, they'll rise to be potentially first choice for people to go, like, listen to instead of Broadway musicals?
I mean, I think, for me, I hope that they continue to get more popular. I don't think that they will ever surpass Broadway, because you've seen things like Pro Shots and movie adaptations where you have a Broadway-esque performance, but it isn't Broadway. And I think that the fact of the matter is, nothing can beat a live performance. No matter how intimate you can get, no matter how good of a story you can tell, there's something about being in the theater and experiencing this story that these people are telling live. They're pouring real emotion and energy into this story, and you're surrounded by other people that are feeling it. Not to get too philosophical, but there's really something so human about just being in a room full of other people, experiencing this story that other people are telling in real time, without any distractions from technology. I say as we're on a YouTube podcast. I don't think that anybody's ever going to stop doing it, but I think that there are enough people that either can't or can't regularly go see live theater, and so I think that this will join the ranks of pro shots and movie adaptations, where it's something that, at least in between theater productions, or if you can't go see theater productions, I think that it will do a pretty good job of providing an alternate experience that isn't trying to be Broadway, but can give you a similar kind of feeling, and hopefully it will continue to be able to do that better and better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope so too.
Another thing that I think is that as technology continues to grow, they're able to do more in a podcast musical. Something that a lot of people have pointed out is that the sound effects in a lot of these shows aren't perfect yet, because it's hard to get a good sounding sound effect to use in this, because either you have to find it from a library or you have to record it yourself. And for some things, that's fine. I mean, you can go record your toaster in 5 seconds, but if you need an explosion or a tree falling on your house, that's a little bit harder to try to find to do. But a lot of these stories rely so heavily on the soundscape. Specifically 36 Questions, like I mentioned, does a good job of that. They build every single sound out, from the footsteps to the wind chimes and the sounds of cars passing and the sounds of the mosquitoes. And I think that is another thing, and I think that is another thing that podcast musicals can do, is immerse you fully in the story. Instead of making you a passive viewer, it makes you active in the scenario. But I think that it lacks a little bit right now in having that quality, because sound effects coming from a filmmaker are just really hard to find or make. So I think that as we continue to get better libraries and better audio equipment, I think that it will continue to grow and adapt and become a better experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And having those extra sound effects that can put you into the story and storyline a lot easier than not having them and trying to imagine them.
Yeah, no, overall, I think that podcast musicals are a relatively new thing that enough people know about at this point that I think it's starting to catch on. And I think that podcast musicals are a really cool idea that I think will continue to grow. I think that enough people know about it now that it's starting to catch steam and starting to grow, and there are starting to be more of them. But it's still, at least I think, in its early years, I still think it's going to grow a lot. And I think that there are lots of opportunities to continue to make the art form better. But I think there's a lot of things you can do with it if you do it right. I'm very excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, I am too.
And now, we've reached the end of today's episode. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for joining us. Sincerely, us.
Next week's episode will be about films in the world of streaming services and how that changes the way entertainment is made. Make sure you join us for that. Until then, make sure you binge all the other episodes of the show, and we'll see you next time.